The four charred bodies swung from the steel girders of the bridge, spanning the Euphrates River, black smoke still rising from their mutilated remains. It was March 31st, 2004, and the images from Fallujah would soon shock the American public and transform U.S. military strategy in Iraq. 4 American contractors from Blackwater Security Consulting had been ambushed, their vehicles set ablaze, their bodies dragged through the streets and hung from the bridge in a grotesque display that would serve as the catalyst for one of the most intense urban battles American forces had fought since Vietnam. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Brennan Byrne stood at the outskirts of Fallujah, binoculars trained on the city that would soon become his battlefield. "This isn't just about retribution," he told his officers. "This is about showing that there are consequences when Americans are murdered." Behind him, battalions of Marines prepared for what would become known as Operation Vigilant Resolve, the First Battle of Fallujah. The city of 300,000 had become a stronghold for insurgents after the fall of Saddam Hussein. Former Ba'athist party members, foreign fighters streaming in from Syria, and local militia had transformed Fallujah into what military analysts were calling the epicenter of the Iraqi insurgency. Intelligence reports indicated between 2,000 and 4,000 fighters were entrenched in the city, armed with everything from AK-47s to rocket-propelled grenades. This context on the Blackwater contractors' deaths is documented in multiple sources, including the Washington Post's April 2004 coverage of the events that triggered the First Battle of Fallujah. Within days of the Blackwater killings, Marine units established positions around the city's perimeter. The 1st Marine, Expeditionary Force Commander, Lieutenant General James Conway, had advocated for a measured approach, surgical raids targeting known insurgent locations rather than a full-scale invasion. But pressure from Washington demanded swift action, a show of force that would demonstrate American resolve. "We're going to pacify Fallujah," Major General James Mattis told his Marines. "If they shoot at us, we will return fire with overwhelming and precise force." On April 5th, tanks and armored vehicles began their approach to the city limits as FA-18 Hornets streaked overhead. Marine snipers took positions on rooftops and high ground. The narrow streets and tightly packed concrete buildings loomed before them, an urban combat nightmare that would test the Marines' training, equipment, and willpower to their limits. As night fell, the Marines received their final orders. At 0400 hours, they would cross the line of departure and enter Fallujah proper. What awaited them was a city transformed into a fortress. Insurgents had spent months preparing fighting positions, booby-trapping buildings, establishing sniper nests, and stockpiling ammunition. The Marines would be fighting an enemy that knew the terrain intimately, an enemy that was prepared to die, an enemy that had nowhere to retreat. Lieutenant Colonel Byrne gathered his company commanders for final instructions. "This will be a house-to-house fight," he warned. "Every room, every alley, every rooftop is a potential kill zone. Move methodically, protect each other, and remember your training." As dawn approached on April 6th, the Marines checked their weapons one last time. Their night vision equipment gave the darkened city an eerie green glow. The calm before the storm was broken only by the distant calls to prayer echoing from Fallujah's minarets, a haunting soundtrack to what would become America's fiercest urban combat since the Vietnam War. The first rays of sunlight had barely crested the horizon when the initial wave of Marines crossed into Fallujah's northeastern neighborhoods. Captain Brian Chantosh led his company through the narrow streets, each Marine scanning windows and doorways for any sign of hostile movement. The silence was unnerving. "It's too quiet," Sergeant James Mattingly whispered to his fire team. "They're waiting for us." He was right. At approximately 0530 hours, the city erupted in gunfire. Insurgents had allowed the Marines to penetrate just far enough into the urban labyrinth before unleashing a coordinated ambush. RPG rounds streaked through the morning air, slamming into Humvees and sending shrapnel flying. Sniper fire rained down from minarets and rooftops. "Contact right! Building with the blue door!" a Marine shouted as a burst of automatic fire sent brick fragments flying around them. The Marines returned fire, their M16 rifles and machine guns creating a deafening orchestra of destruction that echoed through the concrete canyon. According to reporting by Dexter Filkins in the New York Times, April 2004, the initial Marine push into Fallujah encountered resistance. That was far more fierce and organized than anticipated. By midday, the temperature had soared to 95 degrees. Marines in full combat gear, weighing upwards of 70 pounds with body armor, ammunition, and equipment, moved methodically from building to building. The house-clearing procedures they had drilled countless times were now being executed under the most extreme conditions. Two-man teams, alternating cover. Check your corners. Staff Sergeant Manuel Rodriguez barked to his squad as they prepared to enter a suspected insurgent stronghold. Remember, precision fire only. We don't know if civilians are still inside. This was the cruel dilemma of urban warfare in Fallujah. Despite warnings to evacuate, thousands of civilians remained in the city, either unwilling or unable to flee. Each building entry was a calculated risk. Insurgents had been known to use civilians as human shields. The pattern quickly established itself. Enter a building, clear room by room, secure it, move to the next. But the insurgents had prepared for this methodology. Buildings were booby-trapped with improvised explosive devices. Holes had been knocked through adjacent walls, allowing fighters to move unseen between structures. Narrow alleyways became perfect channels for ambushes. By nightfall on the first day, the Marines had penetrated only 4 blocks into the city, at the cost of 9 dead and nearly 40 wounded. Medical evacuation helicopters worked non-stop, braving enemy fire to extract the injured. At his command post, Colonel John Tulin reviewed the day's progress on gridded maps of the city. "We're facing an enemy that's dug in deep," he told his staff. "They've had months to prepare, and they're fighting like hell." Intelligence reports indicated that foreign fighters from Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Chechnya had flocked to Fallujah, seeing it as the front line in a global jihad against America. Many were suicide bombers, willing, even eager, to die taking Americans with them. As night operations began, the Marines employed their technological advantage. Night vision. Goggles allowed them to maneuver in darkness, while thermal imaging scopes detected heat signatures of hidden fighters. But the insurgents countered with their own tactics, using blankets soaked in cold water to mask their body heat and setting tire fires to confuse thermal imaging. In the Operations Tactical Operations Center, General Conway received increasingly concerned communications from Washington. The civilian casualties, though minimized by Marine restraint, were drawing international condemnation. Al Jazeera broadcast graphic images of wounded children being treated in makeshift clinics, fueling anti-American sentiment throughout the Arab world. "We're walking a tightrope here," Conway told his commanders. "We need to neutralize the insurgent threat while minimizing civilian casualties. It's going to be a delicate balance." What no one yet realized was that the First Battle of Fallujah was about to become a political liability too great for the coalition to bear. Even as Marines continued their advance into the city's heart, forces far from the battlefield were about to dramatically alter the course of the operation. By April 9th, the Marines had fought their way nearly a quarter of the way into the city, but at a steep cost. 27 Americans had been killed, over 90 wounded, and civilian casualties were mounting. Hospitals in Fallujah reported dozens of civilians killed, including women and children. Arabic news networks broadcast images of the dead and wounded around the clock, inflaming anti-American sentiment throughout Iraq and the broader Middle East. In Baghdad's Green Zone, Ambassador Paul Bremer conferred urgently with Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez, the overall commander of coalition forces in Iraq. "The political situation is deteriorating rapidly," Bremer explained. "The Iraqi governing council is threatening to resign en masse if we don't halt the offensive." Even America's strongest allies in the Iraqi government were wavering. Ghazi al-Yawar, a prominent Sunni member of the Iraqi governing council, publicly denounced the offensive as collective punishment. The fragile political coalition that the United States had been nurturing since the fall of Saddam Hussein was in danger of complete collapse. According to subsequent reporting in Foreign Affairs Journal, the decision to halt the First Battle of Fallujah was primarily political, made in response to growing outrage throughout Iraq and the Arab world over civilian casualties. On April 9th, under intense pressure from the Iraqi Governing Council and with growing international condemnation, coalition authorities announced a unilateral ceasefire. Marines who had fought block by block, house by house for 4 days were ordered to hold their positions. Captain Michael Shupp gathered his company in the courtyard of a half-destroyed school they'd been using as a temporary headquarters. "I know this isn't what you want to hear," he told his Marines, their faces still streaked with dirt and sweat from the morning's fighting. But effective immediately, were standing down from offensive operations. The frustration among the troops was palpable. They had lost friends, seen comrades evacuated with life-altering injuries, only to be told to stop short of completing their mission. Lance Corporal Anthony Dominguez kicked at the rubble beneath his feet. "So what was the point? What did Garcia and Williams die for if we're just going to hand it back?" The ceasefire called for the formation of the Fallujah Brigade, a force of former Iraqi army officers who would supposedly take control of the city, disarm the insurgents, and apprehend those responsible for killing the Blackwater contractors. Leading this brigade would be General Jassim Mohammed Saleh, a former division commander in Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard who arrived in Fallujah wearing his old uniform. Major General James Mattis watched skeptically as Saleh's forces entered the city. "This isn't going to work," he told his staff. "We're handing the city back to the very people we've been fighting." His prediction would prove tragically accurate. In the weeks that followed, the Fallujah Brigade dissolved, many of its members defecting to the insurgency with their weapons. Rather than pacifying the city, the ceasefire allowed insurgents to regroup, rearm, and strengthen their defensive positions. Fallujah became an insurgent sanctuary, a no-go zone for coalition forces where extremist groups like Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's Al-Qaeda in Iraq established training camps and bomb factories. For the Marines who had fought there, the withdrawal was bitter medicine. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stood at the perimeter watching through binoculars as black flags, the banners of jihadist groups, were raised over buildings they had captured days earlier. "We'll be back," he said grimly. "You can count on that." By June, the Fallujah Brigade had completely collapsed. Insurgent activity emanating from the city increased dramatically, with suicide bombers and IED cells using Fallujah as a safe haven to launch attacks throughout Anbar province. What had been intended as a face-saving political solution had instead created a festering wound in the heart of Iraq's Sunni triangle. In Washington, Pentagon planners began drawing up new options for dealing with Fallujah. It was increasingly clear that a second, larger operation would be necessary. The next battle for Fallujah would need to be decisive, and there would be no ceasefire until the mission was complete. Through the sweltering summer and into the fall of 2000, Fallujah transformed from a city into a fortress. Insurgents used the ceasefire months to construct elaborate defenses, digging tunnels between buildings, creating hidden weapons caches, boobying trapping streets and doorways with improvised explosive devices, and establishing hardened fighting positions. Intelligence estimates suggested the insurgent force had grown to between 3,000 and 5,000 fighters. Foreign jihadists continued to stream into the city, drawn by the narrative of Fallujah as the place where Mujahideen had forced the Americans to retreat. The city became a symbol of resistance and a haven for extremists, including Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, whose Al-Qaeda in Iraq organization used Fallujah as its headquarters. Lieutenant General John Sattler, who had taken command of the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, studied aerial photographs of the city in his operations center at Camp Fallujah. "They've had 6 months to prepare," he told his commanders. "This time, we need overwhelming force and a clear plan to take the entire city." As reported by embedded journalists with Stars and Stripes in November 2004, U.S. military planners spent months developing a comprehensive strategy for the second assault on Fallujah, incorporating lessons learned from the April fighting. The new operation, codenamed Phantom Fury, later renamed Al-Fajr, New Dawn, would dwarf the April assault in both scale and intensity. 6,000 Marines would be joined by 2,000 Army soldiers plus Iraqi security forces. The plan called for a complete cordon around the city, followed by a massive assault from multiple directions. As preparations continued, psychological operations teams broadcast messages urging civilians to evacuate. Humanitarian corridors were established, allowing an estimated 90% of Fallujah's civilian population to flee before the fighting began. By early November, the city's population had dwindled from 300,000 to roughly 30,000, mostly fighting-age men. On November 7, 2004, Iraqi Prime Minister Ayad Alawi announced a state of emergency and gave formal approval for the operation to begin. That night, U.S. forces seized Fallujah General Hospital on the city's western outskirts, a strategic move both to secure a medical facility and to prevent insurgents from using it as a propaganda platform as they had during the April fighting. Under cover of darkness, combat engineers moved forward to breach the railroad embankment on the northern edge of the city, clearing paths through minefields and obstacles for the armored vehicles that would follow. At the same time, artillery units began shelling suspected insurgent positions, and aircraft dropped precision-guided bombs on key buildings identified as command centers. Inside the city, insurgent commander Omar Hussein Hadid gathered his lieutenants in a fortified basement. "The Americans will try to enter the city with their tanks and technology," he told them, "but they will have to leave their armored vehicles to clear buildings. That is when we kill them." Among the American forces poised to enter the city was Sergeant Major Bradley Casal of 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines. A veteran of multiple deployments, Casal had spent weeks preparing his Marines for the house-to-house fighting that lay ahead. "This is going to be the hardest thing most of you have ever done," he told his men during their final briefing. "Trust your training, trust each other, and remember, hesitation gets Marines killed." In the pre-dawn hours of November 8th, the order came down the chain of command: execute Phantom Fury. Tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles began their advance, providing covering fire as Marines moved behind them in formation. The second battle for Fallujah, destined to become the fiercest urban combat since the Vietnam War, had begun. As the first elements crossed into the city proper, the night sky lit up with tracer fire and explosions. Unlike the April battle, there was no gradual escalation. The insurgents unleashed everything they had immediately, confirming what commanders had suspected. This would be a fight to the finish. The dawn of November 8th revealed a surreal urban landscape transformed by war. Minarets stood like silent sentinels above streets choked with rubble. The distinctive crackle of AK-47 fire echoed off concrete walls as Marines advanced methodically into the city's northeastern districts. "Stay tight on the buildings. Watch the rooftops," shouted Staff Sergeant David Bellavia as he led his squad through Fallujah's Jolan district, an older neighborhood of narrow streets and closely packed houses that had become an insurgent stronghold. Every window, every doorway, every alley represented potential danger. The fighting quickly took on a brutal, intimate character. Urban combat reduces warfare to its most primal form. Enemies often separated by only meters, sometimes fighting. Room to room within the same building. Technology and firepower advantages are diminished. Courage, training, and split-second decision-making become paramount. In his memoir, House to House, Staff Sergeant David Bellavia described the intensity of clearing operations. Urban fighting is the most personal of all combat. The enemy is not just a dot on the landscape. You see their eyes, smell their breath, hear their prayers. For the Marines and soldiers, the routine became mechanical through necessity. Approach a building under covering fire, breach the entrance, often using explosives. Enter in fire teams with specific sectors of responsibility, clear room by room, mark the building as secured, move to the next structure. But there was nothing routine about the danger. In one now legendary engagement, a squad from Kilo Company, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, entered what would later be known as Hell House, a seemingly ordinary residential structure that concealed a sophisticated insurgent strongpoint. As the Marines moved inside, they were met with a hail of gunfire from hidden positions. In the chaos that followed, Sergeant Major Bradley Casal and another Marine entered the building to rescue wounded comrades. What happened next would become one of the iconic moments of the battle. Casal found himself in hand-to-hand combat with insurgents, sustaining multiple gunshot wounds and shielding a wounded Marine with his body when a grenade exploded nearby. Despite losing significant blood, Casal continued fighting until reinforcements arrived. A photograph of Casal being helped from the building, his uniform soaked in blood but still gripping his pistol, would become one of the enduring images of the Iraq War. The fighting continued day and night. After dark, the Americans pressed their advantage in night vision technology, conducting raids against insurgent positions identified during daylight reconnaissance. The distinctive green glow of night vision goggles became a terrifying sight for defenders, who often couldn't see their attackers until it was too late. By November 11th, American forces had secured about 70% of the city, but the hardest fighting lay in the southern districts, where intelligence indicated the most hardened foreign fighters had concentrated their defenses. These fighters, Chechens, Saudis, Syrians, and others who had come to Iraq for jihad, had no escape plan. They intended to fight to the death. The toll on both sides was severe. By the battle's midpoint, over 30 Americans had been killed, and hundreds wounded. Insurgent casualties were estimated in the hundreds, perhaps thousands. The city itself was being systematically destroyed. Artillery, tank fire, and precision airstrikes had reduced entire blocks to rubble. For the Marines and soldiers fighting there, the battle's intensity created bonds that would last a lifetime. "In there, it's just you and the guys next to you," Lance Corporal Thomas Wilson wrote in a letter home. "Everything else, politics, media debates, all of it, just fades away. Your whole world narrows down to keeping each other alive and completing the mission." As the second week of fighting began, the remaining insurgents were compressed into an ever-shrinking pocket in the southern part of the city. Their supplies dwindling and their casualties mounting, some attempted to escape by swimming across the Euphrates River or blending in with the few civilians still in the city. Others prepared for a final stand. By November 18th, 10 days into the battle, U.S. forces had pushed the remaining insurgents into a small pocket in the southern corner of the city. With escape routes cut off and supplies exhausted, the fighting took on a desperate quality. Small bands of insurgents launched suicidal counterattacks against Marine positions, often armed with nothing more than assault rifles against tanks and armored vehicles. In the command center, Lieutenant General Sattler reviewed the battle map with his staff. "We've broken their organized resistance," he observed, "but clearing the remaining pockets is going to be painstaking work." He was right. Though the major combat operations were declared complete on November 16, Marines and soldiers continued to encounter isolated resistance for weeks afterward. Hidden fighters emerged from tunnels and concealed rooms to launch attacks before melting away again. Countless booby traps and IEDs remained, claiming lives even after formal hostilities ended. According to the U.S. Marine Corps official history of the battle, the Second Battle of Fallujah involved some of the heaviest urban combat U.S. Marines have been involved in since the Battle of Hue City in Vietnam in 1968. The statistics told a sobering story of the battle's intensity. 95 Americans killed and over 600 wounded. Iraqi security forces lost about 40 troops. Insurgent casualties were harder to verify, but estimated between 1,300 and 2,500 killed. The city itself lay in ruins, with roughly 60% of its buildings damaged or destroyed. As December arrived, the focus shifted to rebuilding. Combat engineers cleared streets of debris and explosives. Civil affairs teams established food and water distribution centers for returning residents. Military police units processed thousands of detainees, separating hardened fighters from those who had been coerced into supporting the insurgency. For Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had fought in both April and November battles, the return to Fallujah brought mixed emotions. Standing amid the rubble of a street he had fought to secure 8 months earlier, he reflected on the cost. "We accomplished the mission," he told a war correspondent. "But I wonder what happens next. Can this place ever really come back from this?" His question would hang over Fallujah for years to come. The city that had been a prosperous center of commerce before the war became a symbol of both American resolve and the devastating consequences of urban warfare. Residents returning to their homes found a changed landscape, buildings reduced to concrete skeletons, infrastructure severely damaged, unexploded ordnance hidden among the debris. The battle achieved its immediate military objectives. Insurgent groups lost their sanctuary, and Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's network was temporarily disrupted. But the political and social aftermath proved complex. Many Sunnis viewed the destruction of Fallujah as collective punishment, further alienating them from the US-backed government in Baghdad. For the Marines and soldiers who fought there, Fallujah became a defining experience, a battle that tested their training, courage, and resolve unlike any other. In the years that followed, many would struggle to explain to family and friends what they had seen and done in those blood-soaked streets. In his final address to the troops before they departed Fallujah, General Sattler acknowledged both their sacrifice and the battle's significance. What you accomplished here will be studied at war colleges for generations. You broke the back of the insurgency at its strongest point, and you did it with professionalism and honor under the most difficult conditions imaginable. By January 2005, limited numbers of civilians began returning to Fallujah under strict security measures. Each resident was biometrically registered, and access to the city was controlled through checkpoints. The reconstruction effort would continue for years, hampered by security concerns and funding limitations. The legacy of Fallujah remains complex and contested. For military historians, it represents one of the most significant urban battles of the 21st century, a textbook example of modern combined arms operations in an urban environment. For Iraqis, it symbolizes both the worst horrors of the war, and for some, a testament to resistance against occupation. What is beyond dispute is the courage shown by those who fought there, Americans, Iraqis, and even their enemies, in one of history's most intense urban battles. The lessons learned in Fallujah's streets would influence military doctrine and urban warfare training for decades to come, even as the city itself slowly rebuilt from the ashes of conflict.